It began quietly, the kind of discovery that barely makes a sound. No alarms, no headlines, just a faint dot moving across a dark screen. Somewhere on Earth, a telescope was pointed toward the night sky, not searching for anything special, just watching, recording, observing. And there it was, a small object drifting along the ecliptic. Cold, distant, unremarkable. They named it 3I/Atlas. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than another interstellar visitor. A traveler from beyond our solar system, a piece of ancient rock, wandering through space for billions of years. Astronomers have seen objects like this before. They appear, they pass through. They disappear back into the dark, predictable, forgettable. And that's exactly what everyone expected this one to be. Just another silent rock passing by. But space has a way of hiding its secrets in plain sight. In the early days, no one was excited. The data was logged. The coordinates were marked. The motion was plotted against the stars. Everything looked normal. The object followed a clean path, cutting through the solar system at an angle that confirmed what scientists already knew. This thing wasn't from here. It came from interstellar space. From somewhere far beyond our sun's influence, beyond our history, beyond our stories. That alone should have been enough to make it special. But familiarity dulls wonder. So the data was passed along quietly, reviewed by tired eyes in dimly lit rooms. Another line added to a growing list of cosmic visitors, until someone noticed something small, something easy to miss. A tiny irregularity. At first, it didn't feel important, just a decimal out of place. A slight wobble in motion, the kind of thing you blame on instruments, or software, or human error. So they checked again and again. The object's path wasn't wrong, but it wasn't perfectly right either. It was subtle, almost polite in the way it refused to behave exactly as expected. Then came the brightness readings, the light curve. A simple measure of how much sunlight the object reflected as it moved. For most objects, this tells a familiar story. Slow rotations, uneven surfaces, dark rock mixed with ice. But 3I/Atlas didn't follow the script. Its brightness shifted, then steadied, then shifted again. Not randomly, not chaotically, just enough to feel off. At first, no one said anything. Because science doesn't panic over feelings. Science trusts numbers, so the numbers were rechecked. Different telescopes, different angles, different nights, and yet the same pattern kept appearing. A faint object, an ordinary visitor, doing something slightly unexpected. It didn't flare like a comet. It didn't tumble wildly like a broken asteroid. It moved with restraint, with control, almost as if it knew it was being watched, and chose to reveal very little. Still, the official notes stayed calm. Likely surface variation. Possible rotation effect. Further observation required. Safe explanations. Comfortable explanations. Because the alternative felt unnecessary. Why assume mystery where none was needed? Why imagine intention in a place ruled by physics? So the world kept turning. Cities slept. Lights flickered on and off across continents. People went to work, unaware that something ancient and unknown was slipping silently past the sun. But in observatories, The watching continued, night after night, and with every pass, the object seemed to whisper the same message: look closer, because the more they observed it, the harder it became to ignore the feeling that this wasn't just another rock. The motion stayed clean, too clean. The brightness stayed restrained, too restrained. There were no dramatic outbursts, no obvious signs of chaos, just quiet consistency, with small, stubborn deviations, like a calm voice holding back a secret. Some researchers started to feel uneasy, not afraid, just unsettled, because space is usually loud in its randomness, messy, violent, unforgiving, but this object moved with a kind of discipline, a kind of patience, as if it had all the time in the universe and no reason to rush. Still, no one used words like strange in public. They used words like interesting, worth monitoring, unusual but explainable. That's how science protects itself, by slowing down curiosity, by wrapping wonder in caution. Yet, late at night, when the data was reviewed in silence, some couldn't shake the feeling that they were looking at something that didn't want to be understood too quickly. A visitor that arrived quietly and intended to leave the same way, without announcing itself, without asking permission, just passing through our neighborhood, long enough to be noticed, but not long enough to be questioned openly. And that's what made the discovery dangerous, not because it was dramatic, but because it was subtle, because history shows us something unsettling. The biggest shifts in human understanding don't begin with explosions. They begin with small doubts, a number that doesn't fit, a pattern that won't align, a whisper in the data that says, "This isn't what you think." As 3I/Atlas continued its slow journey inward, closer to the sun, the question lingered in the background of every observation. Was this truly just another interstellar traveler, or had humanity just noticed something that wasn't meant to be noticed at all? No one had answers yet. Only numbers and silence. But the quiet discovery had already done its damage, because once you see an irregularity, you can never unsee it. And somewhere, drifting through the dark, 3I/Atlas kept moving forward, calm, measured, unbothered, as if it knew something we didn't. And as the sun grew closer, so did the truth. The numbers arrived without warning, not with drama, not with urgency, just another data packet uploaded into a system that had seen millions before. Rows of figures, clean, precise. At first glance, nothing seemed wrong. This was routine. This was familiar. When an object is discovered, one of the first things scientists study is its light curve. It's simple, in theory. As an object spins through space, sunlight hits different parts of its surface. Bright areas reflect more light. Dark areas reflect less. Over time, this creates a pattern, a rhythm. For asteroids, the pattern is rough, uneven, messy. For comets, it's chaotic. Jets of gas, sudden flares, unstable brightness. But 3I/Atlas was neither. When its first light curve was plotted, the room went quiet. The line rose, then fell, then flattened. Then it repeated, not perfectly, but close enough to make people pause. The reflectivity wasn't random. It wasn't tied cleanly to rotation either. It was doing something else, something the models didn't predict. At first, the reaction was simple denial. Instrument noise, someone said. Atmospheric interference, another suggested, because that's how science works. When data doesn't make sense, you don't blame reality, you blame the tools. So they checked the telescope, then the software, then the calibration. Everything came back clean. Still, the numbers refused to behave. The reflectivity of 3I/Atlas rose sharply, then dropped, then stabilized again. As if the object was choosing when to shine. That didn't make sense. Objects don't choose. They react. They tumble. They erode. They break apart under stress. But this didn't look like reaction. It looked like restraint. The next step was comparison. Scientists pulled data from known interstellar objects. Past visitors, old records, nothing matched. Not the amplitude, not the timing, not the smoothness. The light curve of 3I/Atlas wasn't wild, it was controlled. And that made it unsettling. Because control implies structure, and structure implies design. No one said that out loud. Not yet. Instead, they ran simulations. Hundreds of them. What if it's elongated? What if it's flat? What if it's tumbling end over end? Each scenario created a curve. None of them fit. Every model missed something. Always by a little. Always by just enough to matter. And the longer they looked, the worse it felt. Because the changes in brightness didn't line up with physics alone. They lined up with timing. The reflectivity rose, paused, then fell. Not like erosion, not like spinning rock. More like a surface adjusting itself. But that idea was dangerous. So it stayed unspoken. Instead, the team expanded the dataset. More observations, more nights, more angles. Different observatories across the planet joined in. Different skies, different instruments. Same result. The light curve remained stubbornly strange. At this point, frustration set in. Because science is built on trust. Trust in equations. Trust in cause and effect. And here was an object, ignoring both. Some researchers started to feel exposed, not because they were wrong, but because they didn't know why. And there is a special discomfort in that, the kind that creeps in late at night when the screens glow softly and the rest of the world is asleep. One astronomer stared at the data for hours, not searching for answers anymore. Just staring, trying to feel the pattern, trying to understand what the numbers were saying beneath the math. The reflectivity peaks were too clean, too evenly spaced, not exact, but consistent enough to form a rhythm, a quiet rhythm, like breathing. And that thought lingered longer than it should have. Because space does not breathe, space does not care. Yet this object behaved like something managing itself, as if it understood light and adjusted accordingly. Again, no one said it. Instead, they asked a safer question. What if we're wrong about what it's made of? So new material theories were tested. Exotic ices, metal-rich surfaces, carbon composites. Some came close. None explained everything. There was always a leftover anomaly, a remainder, a refusal to fully resolve. And anomalies are dangerous. Because history shows us something. Every major shift in understanding begins as an anomaly, something small, something ignored, something brushed aside until it isn't. At this stage, the official reports remained calm, carefully worded, conservative. Unexpected reflectivity variations observed, further analysis required. But behind closed doors, the mood was changing. This was no longer a curiosity. It was a problem. Because if the models were wrong, then the assumptions behind them might be wrong too. And that's when science becomes uncomfortable. Because assumptions are the foundation. They are the quiet agreements we make about how the universe works. And 3i/Atlas was beginning to question those agreements. Not loudly, not aggressively, just by refusing to fit. As days passed, the object continued its journey inward. Closer to the sun, closer to scrutiny. The light curve kept updating, and every update told the same story. Something about this object was measured, deliberate, not chaotic, and that realization changed the tone. People stopped asking, "What is it?" and started asking, "What if it's not what we think it is?" Still, there was no proof, only discomfort, only patterns that shouldn't exist, and numbers that refused to behave. Because deep down, everyone watching felt it. This wasn't just a failure of instruments. This was something else, something quieter, something more unsettling, as if the universe had slipped a question into our data and waited to see if we would notice. And as 3i/Atlas kept moving forward, the question grew heavier. Were the tools failing? Or were the assumptions finally breaking? And if the assumptions were wrong, what else had we misunderstood all along? The light curve stayed silent, but the doubt it created was just getting started. The sun doesn't negotiate. Anything that drifts too close to it is stripped down, heated, broken apart. Ice turns to vapor. Rock cracks. Surfaces blister and peel away. That's the rule. And as 3i/Atlas continued its quiet journey inward, everyone expected the same outcome. Perihelion was coming, the closest point to the sun, the moment when heat reveals truth. For astronomers, this is where masks fall away. You learn what an object is really made of, because the sun forces it to confess. So expectations hardened, models were prepared, thermal charts were drawn. Predictions were made with confidence. If it was icy, it would flare. If it was rocky, it would heat slowly and unevenly. If it was fragile, it would begin to tear itself apart. Nothing about this phase should have been surprising, but once again, the data refused to cooperate. As 3i/Atlas crossed an invisible threshold and entered stronger sunlight, the sensors woke up. Infrared readings began to stream in. Temperatures rose. At first, everything looked normal, exactly what you'd expect. The object warmed as it approached the sun, responding to the growing radiation. No drama, no mystery, just physics. And then the curve shifted. Not sharply, not violently, just enough to be noticed. The temperature rise slowed. Then it leveled out. That shouldn't happen. There was no known process that could explain it. Closer to the sun means more heat. Always. Yet 3i/Atlas seemed to hesitate, as if something inside it pushed back. The data showed something even stranger. Moments where the surface cooled slightly, despite moving closer to the sun, cooling, near a star. That wasn't just unusual. It was wrong. The first reaction was disbelief. Thermal sensors are sensitive, fragile. So they checked them, then recalibrated, then cross-referenced with other observatories. Different instruments, different teams, same result. The thermal pattern was drifting away from expectations, not exploding, not collapsing, but stabilizing, like a system maintaining balance. And balance has a cost. To resist heat, something must act. Something must absorb, redirect, or regulate energy. Natural objects don't do that intentionally. They surrender. They erode. They lose mass. But 3I/Atlas didn't behave like something surrendering. It behaved like something responding. The closer it came, the clearer it became. Instead of wild spikes, the temperature changes were smooth, gradual, measured, almost careful, as if the object had thresholds, limits, rules of its own. That's when unease crept in, because scientists know what chaos looks like. They know what breakdown looks like. This wasn't either. This was control. Again, no one said the word out loud, but everyone felt it. The heat wasn't just acting on the object was acting back. Some proposed exotic explanations. Maybe a rare composition, maybe deeply layered materials, maybe a structure that trapped and released heat in cycles. So more models were built, more simulations run. And once again, they came close, but never close enough. Every theory explained part of the behavior. None explained all of it. There was always a leftover curve, a leftover dip, a moment where the object cooled when it shouldn't have, and those moments stacked up. The sun grew larger in the sky of 3I/Atlas. Radiation intensified. Pressure increased. This should have been the breaking point. But instead, the thermal data smoothed out even more, as if the object had found equilibrium. That word lingered longer than it should have. Equilibrium, a state systems try to reach. Living systems, engineered systems, not drifting rocks. Someone quietly pointed out something disturbing. The temperature changes lined up with timing, not random exposure, not rotation alone. Timing, intervals, pauses, adjustments. The idea was quickly dismissed, because following that thought led somewhere uncomfortable. So, official statements remained careful. Unexpected thermal stabilization, unusual heat response. Further observation required. But behind the language, the tension was building, because perihelion is where objects reveal their weakness, and 3I/Atlas was doing the opposite. It wasn't weakening. It wasn't shedding. It wasn't screaming under the sun's pressure. It was enduring. And endurance implies preparation. As days passed, a quiet question began to circulate in private conversations, not in papers, not in press releases, just between people who had spent their lives studying space. What if it's built for this? That question hung heavy, because if the object was built to survive close solar passes, then perihelion wasn't a test. It was an environment it expected, and that changes everything. Because suddenly, this wasn't just an interstellar visitor. It was something shaped by conditions beyond our system. Something familiar with stars, something that had been here before. Or somewhere like here. The sun did what it always does. It burned, it pressed, it demanded compliance. And 3I/Atlas answered by staying calm. No violent outgassing, no catastrophic heating, no collapse, just subtle adjustments, quiet resistance, the kind that doesn't draw attention unless you're looking closely. And now, people were looking very closely, because the data wasn't just drifting. It was telling a story. A story where the sun wasn't the dominant force, where this object wasn't a victim of heat, but a participant. And that idea settled deep, uncomfortable, unwelcome, unavoidable. As perihelion approached, the tension grew. Because if 3I/Atlas could handle this, then what else could it handle? And more importantly, why? The sun loomed closer, the measurements sharpened, and somewhere between expectation and reality, a line had been crossed. From observation to suspicion, from curiosity to something quieter, something heavier. Because now the question wasn't just what 3I/Atlas was made of. It was what it was designed to endure. And as the heat continued to rise, the answers stayed just out of reach. Waiting, silent, unmoved, like the object itself. At first, it looked like noise, the kind scientists are trained to ignore. Small spikes, minor dips, flickers that appear when instruments strain at the edge of sensitivity. Space is full of that. Cosmic dust, solar interference, random interference from a noisy universe. So when the brightness data from 3I/Atlas showed tiny fluctuations, no one reacted. Not yet, because when you stare into deep space long enough, you learn one rule quickly. Most strange things are meaningless until they aren't. The pulse didn't announce itself all at once. It crept in quietly between clean data points, a slight rise in brightness, then a fall, then nothing. Then it happened again. Same shape, same duration. Still, it wasn't enough to matter. One observatory noticed it during a routine pass. They flagged it casually, a note in the system. Possible transient variation. Wisdom, weather, nothing dramatic. But on the other side of the planet, another telescope saw the same thing. A rise, a fall. Timed within seconds, that coincidence raised an eyebrow. But coincidences happen, so they waited, and the pulse returned, again. Not louder, not brighter, just consistent. At this point, people leaned closer to their screens. Because noise doesn't repeat itself like that. Not across different instruments, not across different skies. Data from Chile came in, then Hawaii, then Europe. Each dataset independent, each one clean, and each one showing the same thing. A repeating pulse in brightness. Steady, measured, almost calm. The room changed when the graphs were overlaid. The lines didn't just look similar. They matched. Peaks lined up, valleys lined up. Even the spacing between them was nearly identical. That's when silence fell. Because randomness doesn't synchronize itself, especially not across the planet. Someone finally said what everyone was thinking. This isn't noise. The word pulse appeared for the first time. Not in a report, not in a headline, just spoken quietly. Pulse. It was the best word for it. Not a flare, not a burst, a pulse. Something that rises, rests, and falls again and again. The timing wasn't perfect, but it was close enough to feel intentional. The pulse appeared, then vanished, then returned on schedule, as if something was switching states, reflecting more light, then less. The next step was obvious. They tried to break it. Adjusted filters, changed exposure times, switched observation windows. If this was an artifact, it would disappear. It didn't. The pulse remained. Unbothered by scrutiny, unchanged by method. That's when tension entered the room. Because science doesn't fear the unknown. It fears patterns without explanation. Someone asked the safest question possible. Could it be rotation? So rotational models were brought back out, but the pulse didn't match rotation speed. It was too regular, too brief, and it didn't care which side of the object should have been facing the sun. That was a problem. Another suggestion followed. Outgassing? But there were no signs of jets, no plumes, no dust trails, nothing violent enough to explain sudden brightness shifts. This wasn't an explosion. It was modulation. The pulse didn't scream, it whispered. Then came the most uncomfortable realization. The pulse didn't just repeat, it adjusted. As 3I/Atlas moved closer to the sun, the pulse timing shifted slightly. Not randomly, proportionally, as if it were aware of changing conditions. As if the pulse was responding to environment. That was the moment people stopped typing and just stared. Because now, this wasn't just a repeating pattern. It was an adaptive one. Across observatories, private messages began to circulate. Short, careful. Are you seeing this too? Yes. Same timing, same shape. No one wanted to be the first to jump too far, because there's a line scientists are trained never to cross without proof. But that line was getting closer, and the pulse kept going, steady, uninterrupted, as if 3I/Atlas didn't care who was watching. Or maybe, as if it expected to be watched, someone plotted the pulse frequency against no natural processes. Nothing fit. No known thermal oscillation. No structural vibration. No surface chemistry. Everything fell short. The pulse existed without permission, without explanation. At this stage, the word signal appeared for the first time. Not officially, not publicly, just quietly. Signal doesn't mean message. Not necessarily. It means information. A change that carries meaning. And meaning implies choice. The most disturbing part wasn't the pulse itself. It was its restraint. If this were natural, it would be sloppy. If it were catastrophic, it would escalate. But this stayed calm, measured, almost polite, like a lighthouse blinking in the dark. Not to shout, but to be seen. That metaphor unsettled people more than they admitted, because humanity has searched the skies for signals for decades. Radio waves, laser bursts, artificial patterns. And here was something simpler, something quieter. A change in reflected light, something you'd miss, unless you were already watching closely. The pulse didn't try to announce itself. It didn't demand attention. It revealed itself only to those already paying attention, and that made it feel deliberate. Still, no conclusions were drawn, because conclusions change careers. They change history. Instead, scientists did what they always do. They gathered more data, watched more carefully, and hoped the universe would explain itself. But the universe stayed silent. Only the pulse spoke. On, off, on, off, like a heartbeat. And that comparison lingered longer than anyone was comfortable with. Because heartbeats belong to systems that regulate themselves. Systems with thresholds, with timing, with purpose. As 3I/Atlas continued its approach, the pulse didn't fade. It didn't grow stronger either. It remained exactly what it was. Consistent, unassuming, unignorable. And now a quiet divide had formed. Those who believed this would eventually resolve into something ordinary, and those who feared it wouldn't. Because if this pulse was natural, it would break eventually. Physics always wins. But if it wasn't, then the question wasn't whether it was artificial. The question was why it was so careful, why it didn't announce itself loudly, why it chose a signal so easy to dismiss, unless dismissal was the point. As the data streamed in night after night, one thing became clear. Noise had become pattern. Pattern had become signal. And signal demands interpretation. But interpretation carries responsibility. And no one was ready for what that responsibility might mean. So they kept watching, kept recording, kept pretending this was still just data. While deep down, something had shifted. Because once you recognize a pulse, you can't stop listening for it. And somewhere, drifting through sunlight and shadow, 3I/Atlas kept pulsing, steady, quiet, patient, waiting for us to decide whether we were ready to hear what it might mean. The heat should have destroyed it by now. That's what everyone expected. As 3I/Atlas pushed deeper into the sun's reach, the rules were supposed to tighten. Radiation intensifies. Energy overwhelms structure. Weak things fail. That's how it always goes. And yet, the numbers told a different story. The first thermal spike came suddenly. Infrared sensors lit up as the surface temperature climbed faster than predicted. Not shocking, not alarming, just the sun doing what it does best. But then, the spike stopped. Not gradually, not after a flare or release of material. It simply stopped. The temperature held. That alone was strange. Then it dropped. Only slightly, but enough to register across multiple instruments. Cooling while moving closer to the sun. That wasn't just unexpected. That was impossible. At least, it should have been. The immediate reaction was confusion. Data like this doesn't get emotional responses. It gets skepticism. So once again, the tools were blamed. Sensors recalibrated. Readings cross-checked. Error margins widened. Still, the pattern held. Heat rose, heat fell. Then it stabilized, as if something inside the object had found a balance point and refused to move past it. That's when the room went quiet. Because stabilization means regulation, and regulation implies response. Natural objects don't regulate temperature. They absorb energy until they can't anymore. They crack, they vent, they lose mass. But 3I/Atlas didn't vent. It didn't shed visible material. There were no plumes, no jets, no debris trailing behind it like a comet's tail. It remained intact, calm, whole, as if the heat was something it had planned for. The next set of readings made things worse. As solar exposure increased, the internal thermal gradient flattened. That means the temperature difference between sunlit and shadowed regions decreased. In simple terms, the heat was spreading evenly, too evenly. Most objects heat unevenly. One side burns, the other lags behind. But this object distributed energy with efficiency, almost like a system designed to prevent hotspots. Someone quietly pointed out the implication. Efficient heat distribution reduces structural stress. It prevents cracking. It preserves integrity. That's not random luck. That's design logic. The idea wasn't welcomed. So alternative explanations flooded the room. Layered materials, strange porosity, unknown composites. Each theory explained one piece and failed another. The spikes still happened, the drops still followed, and the stabilization always came at nearly the same threshold, like a limit, like a boundary it refused to cross. What unsettled people most wasn't the behavior itself, it was the consistency. This wasn't a one-time anomaly, it happened again and again. Every time the thermal environment changed, the object responded. Not violently, not defensively, but calmly, as if adjusting internal states. That's when someone asked the question no one wanted on record: is it managing its temperature? The room didn't answer, because once you ask that, you can't unask it. Managing implies awareness, not consciousness, not thought, but rules. Rules encoded into structure. Rules that decide when to absorb, when to release, and when to hold steady. That's what machines do. That's what engineered systems do. But this wasn't supposed to be either. It was supposed to be debris, a leftover, a meaningless shard from another star system. And yet, it behaved like something built to survive stars. The sun pushed harder. Radiation intensified. The readings came in. Spike. Drop. Stabilize. Again. No panic, no breakdown. Just response. Some scientists began comparing the data to spacecraft. Not publicly, just in private. Heat shields. Thermal tiles. Passive regulation systems. The similarities were uncomfortable. Because spacecraft are designed with intent. Every layer has a purpose. Every response has a reason. And here was an object with no known origin, behaving like it understood thermal limits. Someone finally said what everyone had been circling. Matter doesn't do this by accident. That sentence changed the room, because it wasn't a claim. It was an observation. Matter follows physics blindly. It doesn't adapt. It doesn't decide. Unless something has shaped it to behave that way. The official language remained cautious. Unexplained thermal modulation, non-standard heat response, requires further study. But privately, the tone had shifted. This was no longer about curiosity. It was about implications. If an object could regulate itself without active systems, without emissions, without visible mechanisms, then what else could it do? What other limits was it designed to respect? And more importantly, why? The sun continued its assault, and 3I/Atlas continued its calm resistance. That contrast became impossible to ignore. The most violent force in our system met with quiet endurance, no drama, no spectacle, just subtle control. That kind of behavior doesn't draw attention, it avoids it, which raised a darker possibility. What if this wasn't about survival? What if it was about remaining unnoticed? Thermal spikes are loud in data. They announce stress. They reveal weakness. But a stabilized profile, that blends in. That looks boring, unless you know what you're looking at, unless you're paying attention. And now, scientists were paying very close attention, because the dangerous question lingered in every room, not spoken aloud, but present. Can matter behave with intent without being alive? Can structure encode decision without thought? If the answer is yes, then intelligence doesn't have to look like us. It doesn't have to speak. It doesn't have to transmit radio waves. It can exist silently, embedded in material, waiting. The heat data kept coming, and the pattern never broke. Spike, drop, stabilize, like a heartbeat that refuses to race, like a system that knows its limits. As 3I/Atlas passed deeper through sunlight, one thing became clear. This wasn't a failure of physics, it was a demonstration of it, used carefully. And that realization sat heavy, because once you accept that possibility, the universe feels very different, colder, more intentional, and far less empty than we once believed. The sun kept burning, the object kept holding, and somewhere between heat and silence, the idea took root. This wasn't just an object reacting to space. It was something shaped by it, prepared for it, and whatever shaped it understood exactly what it was doing. The data didn't scream. It whispered, and what it whispered was terrifying, because it suggested that intent doesn't need life, it only needs design. And as the readings stabilized one last time, the question stopped being hypothetical. If this object could manage heat, what else could it manage? And why had it chosen to pass so close right now? The sun gave no answers. The object gave none either. Only silence, measured, controlled, and utterly without cause. There was a moment, small, quiet, almost easy to miss, when 3I/Atlas stopped looking like stone. It happened during a routine pass. No special alert. No urgent meeting. Just sunlight, hitting the object at a new angle. And suddenly, the brightness jumped. Not bloomed, not flared. Reflected. Cleanly, sharply. Like light off glass. Like light off metal. At first, it felt like a trick of geometry. Angle matters in space. A slight change can turn dull rock into a brief sparkle, so no one panicked. Yet, but then it happened again. Same angle, same response. The reflectivity wasn't rough. It wasn't scattered. It was precise, too precise. Most natural objects scatter light unevenly, tiny pits, jagged edges, dust, ice. Even the smoothest asteroids still blur sunlight. But this didn't blur. It returned the light straight back, like a mirror turning its face toward the sun. Someone adjusted the contrast on the screen. The spike didn't soften, it sharpened. And that's when the discomfort began. Because reflectivity tells a story. It tells you about surface texture, material composition, structure. And this story didn't match rock. It didn't match ice either. Ice diffuses. It glows. This didn't glow. It flashed, brief, controlled, almost intentional. The object rotated slowly. As it did, the brightness fell back to normal. Then, at another specific angle, it returned, the same clean reflection. Same intensity, same duration, as if only certain faces were allowed to shine. That detail mattered, because randomness doesn't repeat with restraint. If this were jagged rock, reflections would be messy, spikes everywhere, no rhythm. But here, the reflectivity appeared, then disappeared, only when geometry aligned just right. That suggests flatness, smoothness, order. Someone finally said it quietly. That looks engineered. No one responded. not because they disagreed, but because acknowledging that sentence meant crossing a line. So instead, they did what scientists always do. They measured. Reflectivity coefficients were calculated, surface albedo compared. Material libraries pulled up. Nothing fit. Metallic surfaces came close, too close. But there was a problem. Metal shouldn't be there, not in interstellar debris. Not exposed, not clean. Space weathers surfaces brutally. Radiation roughens everything. Micrometeorites scar even hardened alloys. Yet this surface behaved like it had been protected, preserved, as if time hadn't touched it, or as if time had been accounted for. The reflectivity wasn't global. That was the strangest part. Only parts of the object reflected this way, not the whole surface. Selective, purposeful, like panels, or facets, or shields. The comparison hung in the air. Spacecraft use reflective surfaces to manage heat, to redirect radiation, to control thermal load, and suddenly, the earlier thermal data felt connected. Heat regulation, controlled spikes, stabilization. Now reflectivity, not as a side effect, but as a tool. Someone overlaid reflectivity spikes with thermal changes. The alignment wasn't perfect, but it was close enough to feel wrong. Reflective moments coincided with thermal relief, as if the object was shedding energy by design. That realization hit quietly, because it meant the surface wasn't just reflective, it was functional. Functional surfaces don't happen by accident. They are chosen, shaped, placed where they matter most. Still, the official language stayed neutral. Unusually high reflectivity at specific phase angles, safe words, words that keep doors closed. But behind those words, a harder question pressed forward. If this wasn't random, then what was it? Polished metal doesn't form naturally in space. Flat surfaces don't survive unscarred, and selective reflectivity doesn't emerge from chaos. Someone brought up a past example, an object once observed reflecting light so strongly it briefly outshone expectations. That object had been artificial, human-made, a piece of space hardware. That comparison wasn't spoken aloud, but everyone thought it. Because the physics was the same. Light obeys rules, and here it was obeying them too well. The object wasn't scattering sunlight. It was directing it, choosing where it went, choosing when it returned, as if the surface knew where the sun was and how to respond. That thought lingered. Uncomfortable, because knowledge doesn't require awareness, just structure, just design. The reflectivity didn't increase as the object heated. It activated at angles, which meant geometry mattered more than temperature. That ruled out melting, ruled out accidental smoothing. This wasn't damage. It was shape, and shape carries intention. The silence in observatories grew heavier. No one rushed to conclusions, but no one joked anymore either. Because once you start talking about surfaces, you start talking about purpose. And purpose opens doors no one wants opened too quickly. What kind of surface reflects like that? Not rock, not ice. Something layered, something treated, something meant to endure, something meant to manage energy, quietly. The reflectivity peaks were brief, almost shy, as if the object didn't want to shine too brightly, didn't want to draw attention. That detail mattered more than the brightness itself. Because if something were trying to announce itself, it would reflect constantly. It would scream. This didn't. It whispered, only when the alignment was perfect, only when it couldn't help it. Which raised a chilling possibility. What if this reflectivity wasn't a feature, but a limitation? What if the object was trying not to reflect, but physics occasionally forced it to? That idea unsettled everyone who considered it, because it meant concealment, not communication. The sun kept moving relative to the object. Angles shifted, and with them the flashes came and went. Predictable, repeatable, controlled. At this point, denial became harder, because each new dataset told the same story. This surface wasn't accidental. It was chosen, and whatever chose it understood light, understood heat, understood stars. The reflectivity didn't answer questions. It sharpened them. If this object was designed, then design implies origin, and origin implies maker. Not necessarily alive, not necessarily present, but intentional. And that idea changed how people looked at the data. This was no longer about what 3i/Atlas was made of. It was about why it was made this way. Why reflect just enough light to regulate heat, but not enough to be obvious? Why pass through the inner system at all? Why now? The sun blazed, the object glided on. And each time it caught the light just right, the universe blinked back at us, cleanly, like a mirror held up to our expectations. And in that reflection, one truth grew clearer. This wasn't debris, this wasn't chance, this was structure, surviving exactly as it was meant to. And as 3i/Atlas continued its silent passage, the question stopped being academic. If this reflectivity wasn't random, then someone, somewhere, once decided how this object should face a star. And that decision had traveled across interstellar space, just to reach us. The light faded, the angle passed, but the implication stayed. Because mirrors don't form in the dark. They are made to reflect something back. And the unsettling thought lingered long after the brightness fell away. What was this object meant to reflect, and who was it meant for? The idea didn't arrive with an announcement. It slipped in quietly, between emails, between late-night messages, between people who trusted each other enough to be honest. No one wanted to be the first to say it out loud. Because once you say it, you can't take it back. It started as a question. Not bold, not dramatic, just careful. What if this isn't natural? At first it sounded reckless, almost embarrassing. Science doesn't jump to conclusions. It doesn't chase ghosts. And yet, the data was still there. The controlled heat, the selective reflectivity, the repeating pulse. Each anomaly alone could be explained away. Together, they formed a shape, and shapes invite interpretation. A small group of researchers began comparing notes privately, not in meetings, not in published papers, in quiet conversations, encrypted messages, late calls across time zones. They weren't trying to convince anyone. They were trying to protect themselves. Because careers are built on credibility, and credibility doesn't survive words like artificial. So the language stayed cautious. They didn't say alien. They didn't say craft. They said things like engineered behavior, non-random structure, functional response, safe phrases, academic phrases, but beneath them, the meaning was clear. This object behaved like something designed. Not alive, not conscious, but shaped by intent. That distinction mattered, because intent doesn't require a mind. It only requires a goal. The researchers laid the data side by side. Thermal regulation, reflective surfaces, timed pulses. Each feature served a purpose. Heat control prevents failure. Reflectivity manages energy. Pulses suggest internal state changes. No single feature proved anything. But together, they fit a profile no natural object should fit. Someone finally used the phrase artificial origin hypothesis, not loudly, not confidently, almost apologetically. The room didn't react at first, because the weight of that phrase takes time to settle. Artificial origin means manufactured. Manufactured means maker. Maker means history beyond Earth. And that breaks more than models. It breaks perspective. The group agreed on one thing immediately. This could not go public. Not yet. Not without overwhelming evidence. Because once the idea escapes, you don't control how it grows. It turns into headlines, into fear, into certainty without proof, and science collapses under that weight. So the idea stayed underground, passed like contraband, shared only with those who had seen the same patterns, those who felt the same discomfort. And there were more of them than anyone expected. Across institutions, across countries, people were noticing the same thing. The same quiet order, the same restraint, the same refusal to behave like debris. But no one wanted to be the first to attach meaning, because meaning changes responsibility. If this object was artificial, then it wasn't just a curiosity. It was evidence. Evidence that something, somewhere, builds things that cross stars, not to visit, not to communicate, but to pass through. That possibility chilled the room because it suggested something far older than us, far quieter, far more patient, and possibly indifferent. The researchers revisited older data with new eyes, not searching for proof, searching for consistency. And consistency was everywhere. The object never overreacted, never wasted energy, never drew attention unnecessarily. It behaved like something built to endure, not to announce. That detail mattered more than anything else. If someone wanted to be seen, they would shine brighter, pulse louder, leave marks. This object didn't. It blended in, except when physics forced it not to, which suggested concealment, or at least efficiency. Someone raised a chilling thought. What if this isn't meant for us at all? That idea lingered. Because if the object was artificial, then Earth wasn't the destination. We were just nearby. Observers by accident, like ants watching a satellite pass overhead, aware of movement, but not meaning. The group debated possible purposes: probe, relic, debris from something larger. None fit perfectly, because purpose requires context, and context was missing. All they had was behavior, and behavior told a story of intelligence without presence, design without communication, movement without urgency, which raised a deeper fear. What if this wasn't new? What if objects like this pass through all the time, and we simply don't notice? Because we aren't looking for quiet intelligence. We're looking for noise, radio bursts, signals, lights. But this This was subtle, elegant, almost humble. The artificial hypothesis didn't excite anyone, it sobered them. Because excitement belongs to discovery. This felt like intrusion, like realizing your house has always been visible from somewhere you never checked. The researchers knew the risks. If they were wrong, they'd look foolish. If they were right, the implications were unbearable. So they chose silence. Careful silence. The hypothesis spread slowly, from trusted colleague to trusted colleague, always framed as a question, never a claim. What do you think? Does this bother you too? Am I overthinking this? The answer was almost always the same. A pause. Then, no, you're not. That pause said everything, because it meant doubt had taken root. Not wild speculation, measured doubt. The kind that changes how you look at the sky. The idea didn't change the data, it changed the interpretation. Suddenly, every restraint felt deliberate. Every limit felt chosen. Every anomaly felt intentional. And intention is the one thing science is least comfortable attributing to matter. Because once you do, you're no longer alone in the universe, not in the abstract, in the practical sense. The artificial hypothesis stayed in the shadows, but it was alive now, growing, waiting. Because once an idea fits the data better than any other explanation, it doesn't matter how dangerous it is, it survives. As 3I/Atlas continued its journey outward, the researchers watched quietly, not hoping for proof, almost hoping for the opposite. Because confirmation would change everything, and denial was becoming harder by the day. The object never acknowledged us, never reacted to observation, never changed course. It behaved exactly like something that didn't care who was watching, and that might have been the most unsettling detail of all. Because indifference is not chaos, it is confidence. The artificial hypothesis remained unspoken in public, but privately, it had already reshaped the conversation. The question was no longer, what is this object? It had become, what kind of universe allows this, and never warned us? And as the idea spread silently through the scientific world, one truth became unavoidable. If this object was artificial, then we had crossed a line in understanding. Not because we discovered something, but because something had passed by us and revealed itself just enough to be noticed. Once spoken aloud, the idea would never stop echoing. So for now, it remained a whisper. But whispers travel far in silence. And the silence around 3I/Atlas was growing louder every day. The silence came first, before any announcement, before any official decision, just silence. Once the idea of artificiality entered the room, something changed. Curiosity sharpened, attention narrowed. If this object was designed, then someone, somewhere, once understood signals. And if signals existed, they could be found. So quietly, carefully, scientists began to listen. Not publicly, not dramatically. They didn't want to wake the world over a guess. Radio telescopes were pointed toward 3I/Atlas. Then optical instruments. Then anything sensitive enough to catch a whisper from the dark. They listened across frequencies. Wide bands, narrow bands, looking for patterns, for repetition, for intent. And what came back was familiar. Cosmic noise, static from distant stars, background radiation from the early universe. The endless hum of space doing what it always does. Nothing unusual, nothing clear, nothing that could be called a message. At first, that felt like relief, because silence is comfortable. Silence means nothing is happening. Silence means we imagined too much. But the silence didn't behave like absence. It behaved like restraint, because if the object was artificial, then communication wasn't a mystery to it. And yet, it chose not to speak. That choice mattered. Human-made probes speak constantly. They announce themselves. They transmit telemetry. They leave trails of data. This didn't. It moved through our system without a word. No radio leak, no beacon, no reply, not even accidental noise. That was strange, because machines make noise, even passive ones. Circuits hum. Structures resonate. Systems leak energy. Yet 3i/Atlas gave nothing back, as if it had been built not to be heard. The silence grew heavier as more data came in, not because something was missing, but because nothing was. It was clean, too clean. Some researchers joked uneasily. If it's trying to hide, it's doing a good job. The joke didn't land because hiding implies awareness, and awareness implies intent. Once again the question returned, not what it was, but why it behaved this way. The team checked for modulation. Changes in reflectivity tied to observation windows. Nothing. They checked for response to radar. Nothing. They checked for reaction to increased attention. Nothing. The object did not care. Or it cared enough not to show it. And that distinction mattered. Because ignoring observation is one thing, avoiding response is another. The silence didn't feel empty, it felt chosen, like a closed door. And closed doors are messages in themselves. The phrase surfaced quietly in conversation. Silence can be a signal. At first, it sounded poetic. Then, uncomfortably accurate. In communication theory, silence isn't neutral. It carries meaning. It says, I hear you. It says, I'm not responding. It says, there is a boundary here. That idea unsettled people more than any burst of radio waves could have. Because noise is easy to dismiss. Silence forces interpretation. The object's behavior fit the pattern. It allowed itself to be seen just enough. Reflected light when angles forced it. Emitted heat only within limits. Pulsed subtly, then stopped. But when it came to direct engagement, nothing. No invitation, no acknowledgement. Almost as if observation was expected, but interaction was not. Someone compared it to wildlife. Animals that freeze when watched. Not because they are unaware, but because staying still keeps them safe. The comparison made the room uncomfortable, because freezing implies threat. But what was the threat here? Us? Or something else? The silence stretched on. Days passed. Then weeks. Still nothing. And slowly, disappointment gave way to something deeper. Understanding. Because the longer they listened, the more obvious it became. This object was not here to talk, not to teach, not to announce its origin. It was here to pass through. And passing through does not require conversation. That realization hurt more than fear ever could. Because fear implies importance. Silence implies insignificance. If this object was artificial, then we were not the intended audience. We were incidental, observers who happened to be nearby. That idea stripped humanity of its central role. No chosen species. No cosmic greeting. Just a bystander watching something far older, far quieter, move on without us. The silence also carried discipline. No accidental emissions. No errors. No breakdowns under scrutiny. It was as if the object had rules. Rules about interaction. Rules about exposure. Rules about remaining silent. And rules are written, not by chance. The most unsettling possibility emerged slowly. What if this wasn't silence because it couldn't speak, but silence because it didn't need to? Advanced systems don't broadcast. They observe. They collect. They wait. They pass through environments unnoticed. That possibility reframed everything. The pulse, the heat regulation, the reflectivity. All of it could serve one goal: survival, not engagement. And survival does not require conversation. Someone finally voiced the thought no one wanted to hear. If it wanted us to know, we would. That sentence ended several discussions because it was true. If an intelligence capable of crossing stars wanted attention, it would not whisper. It would not hide behind ambiguity. It would be unmistakable. And this was not. This was subtle, careful, almost polite. The silence forced a different kind of awareness. Not, are we alone? But, are we being ignored? That question lingered longer than any signal could. Because it suggests a universe that doesn't care about our readiness. A universe where intelligence exists, but doesn't revolve around us. The listening continued. Not because anyone expected a reply, but because stopping felt like giving up, and yet the silence never broke. 3. I/Atlas glided on, unresponsive, unchanged, as if observation itself was irrelevant. The object did not accelerate, did not alter course, did not acknowledge attention. It behaved exactly like something that had passed through countless systems before, systems that may have watched, listened, and heard nothing. And that idea settled deep, because it meant this moment wasn't special. It was routine for something far beyond us. The silence wasn't hostile. It wasn't dismissive. It was neutral, which somehow felt worse, because neutrality suggests confidence. Confidence that nothing we do matters to its mission. And that mission, whatever it was, continued uninterrupted. As the object drifted farther away, the instruments kept listening. Less hopeful now, more reflective, because the absence of sound had become its own answer. Not a comforting one. Not a terrifying one. A sobering one. Silence, it turned out, was not emptiness. It was information. Information that said, you are not the center. You are not addressed. You are simply present. And as 3I/Atlas slipped deeper into the dark, carrying its quiet with it, one truth remained. If this object was artificial, then the universe has rules we do not set. And sometimes the most powerful signal is the decision not to speak at all. The sky said nothing. And for the first time, that nothing felt intentional. Heavy, final. Like a message we weren't meant to receive, but understood anyway. At some point, denial stops being useful. Not because fear takes over, but because the evidence stops asking politely. It started with structure, quietly, buried beneath numbers and graphs that most people would never see. As the data grew richer, models became sharper. Surface readings fed into internal simulations. Thermal behavior was mapped against reflectivity. Pulse timing was layered on top. And something unexpected emerged. Not chaos, not randomness, order. beneath the surface of 3I/Atlas, the models began to reveal layers, distinct ones. Not gradual changes in density, but boundaries, clear separations, as if one material ended and another began. That alone was strange. Natural objects don't form in neat layers. They're born in violence, shattered, compressed, stirred by gravity and time. Their insides are messy. But this wasn't messy. This was aligned. Clean transitions, consistent spacing. Too consistent. Someone described it simply. It looks assembled. That word changed everything, because assembled implies sequence, and sequence implies intent. The team pushed the models harder. What if the surface wasn't the story, but a shell? What if everything strange we'd seen so far, the heat regulation, the reflectivity, the pulse, were symptoms of something deeper? The simulations adjusted, and suddenly the data fit better. Too well. Internal layers explained the thermal control. Structured surfaces explained the reflectivity. Compartmentalized regions explained the pulse. What had once felt disconnected now felt unified, like parts of the same system. And that's when the word no one wanted to use began to circulate. Not publicly, not even confidently, just carefully. Machine. Not a ship, not a vehicle. A machine. Something built to perform a function. Machines don't have to think. They don't have to feel. They just do what they were designed to do. And this one was doing it perfectly. The realization didn't bring excitement. It brought a strange kind of calm. Because machines are predictable. And predictability is easier to face than mystery. But then came the harder question. If this was a machine, then it wasn't made for us. That truth settled quickly. No effort to communicate. No effort to hide completely either. Just quiet passage. Like a tool moving through an environment it doesn't care about. Which meant Earth wasn't special. The sun wasn't special. This system wasn't special. We were just in the way. That thought stripped away comfort. Because humans like to believe discovery is about us, that the universe waits for our awareness. This did not feel like that. This felt like crossing paths with something that had its own timeline, its own priorities, its own destination. Someone asked the question out loud. If it's a machine, what is it doing? No one answered, because intention is harder to read than structure. Still, theories emerged. Survey probe. Relic. Long-dead technology still following ancient instructions. None were satisfying, because all of them assumed relevance. And relevance wasn't guaranteed. What if this machine wasn't observing us? What if it was observing something else entirely? The sun, interstellar space, time itself. Or maybe nothing at all. Maybe it was simply moving, completing a path laid out millions of years ago. That raised the most unsettling question of all. Why now? Why pass so close to Earth's era? Why cross our detection threshold in this moment of history? The uncomfortable answer was also the simplest. Coincidence. We happened to exist at the same time, just advanced enough to notice, not advanced enough to understand. That realization humbled everyone involved. Because it meant this moment wasn't a meeting. It was an overlap. Two timelines brushing against each other. Briefly, the machine didn't slow down, didn't adjust course, didn't acknowledge proximity. It followed its trajectory with indifference. the kind of indifference that comes from certainty. Certainty that nothing here matters to its function. The models grew more confident, not in purpose, but in structure. This was not debris, not erosion, not a natural oddity. This was architecture, built to survive interstellar space, built to endure stars, built to remain silent. And that silence made sense now. Machines don't explain themselves. They don't announce meaning. They perform. And once the function is complete, they move on. The idea that this object had passed through countless systems before ours became harder to ignore. Stars ignited and died. Civilizations may have risen and fallen without ever noticing it. And here it was, passing through ours, briefly, casually. That perspective hurt, because it placed humanity in a very small frame, not unique, not central, just another moment along a path. Someone described it in a way that stuck. This isn't a visitor, it's a commuter. That sentence captured everything. A commuter doesn't stop, doesn't look around, doesn't care who notices. It follows a route, and this route happened to pass near us, which brought the question back again. Why this route? Why this timing? The models couldn't answer that. They only showed trajectory, a path shaped long before humans looked up, long before telescopes, long before names. The machine was old, possibly unimaginably old. And age carries intent too, because whatever built it expected it to last, expected it to keep moving long after its creators were gone. That idea felt heavier than fear, because it suggested a universe filled with abandoned machines, silent systems still doing their jobs, crossing stars, ignoring us. The machine passed perihelion, handled the sun, and now it was leaving. The opportunity to study it was shrinking. With every day it drifted farther, harder to observe, harder to model, harder to understand. And that urgency created tension, not panic, reflection. Because once it was gone, it would take its answers with it. And there was no guarantee another would come, or that we would notice. As 3I/Atlas moved outward, the idea solidified. This wasn't about first contact. It wasn't about invasion. It wasn't about communication. It was about realization. Realization that intelligence doesn't need to look back. That machines can outlive meaning. That the universe might be full of things doing important work without ever caring who sees them. If this was a machine, then Earth was just another waypoint. And if that's true, then the real question isn't what is it? It's how many others have already passed without us ever knowing. The machine didn't answer. It didn't slow. It didn't hesitate. It simply continued along a path written long before we existed, and as it slipped deeper into the dark, one truth became unavoidable. This wasn't a moment chosen for us. We just happened to be alive when it passed. And that might be the most unsettling discovery of all, because it means the universe is not waiting. It is moving, relentlessly, quietly, and sometimes a machine passes through, just close enough to remind us how small we really are. Something subtle began to change. Not all at once, not with panic or headlines, just a shift, a feeling. At first, the story of 3I/Atlas lived in quiet corners of the internet, science forums, late-night videos, carefully worded articles that avoided bold claims. But people noticed. Because humans are good at sensing when something doesn't fit. You could feel it in the comments, in the pauses between sentences, in the way people reread the same lines twice. This feels different. Public awareness didn't explode. It seeped, slowly, quietly. And with it came a strange kind of awakening. Not fear, not excitement, perspective. For centuries, humanity has looked into the sky as observers, pointing instruments outward, listening, searching, always asking the same question. Are we alone? But now, that question felt outdated. Because 3I/Atlas wasn't calling out. It wasn't waving. It wasn't trying to be found. It had simply passed through. And that changed everything. People began to realize something unsettling. Maybe the universe doesn't announce intelligence. Maybe it doesn't knock. Maybe it just moves, and we only notice when we're finally quiet enough to see it. That thought spread faster than any official statement ever could, because it didn't require belief. It only required humility. Late-night hosts joked about it nervously. Scientists chose their words more carefully. The public leaned in, not for answers, but for meaning. Because if something artificial had crossed our solar system, then Earth wasn't isolated. It was permeable, reachable. And that realization reframed humanity's place in the cosmos. We've always imagined contact as dramatic, lights in the sky, voices from the stars, a moment where everything changes. But this wasn't that. This was quieter, colder, more unsettling. This was the idea that intelligence doesn't need us to notice it, that we might be living in a universe already shaped by forces far older, far more patient than we ever imagined. People started asking different questions. Not who built it, but how many times has this already happened? Not why us, but why would it ever be about us? The shift was philosophical, existential, because humans like stories where they are central, chosen, special. But 3I/Atlas suggested something else. That we are observers by accident, not because we were invited, but because we happened to look up at the right moment. That idea landed heavily. You could see it in the way people talked about space. Less romance, more realism. Less destiny, more scale. The universe suddenly felt older. Not just in years, but in intention. And intention is uncomfortable, because it implies purpose beyond our understanding. Some felt small, others felt calm. A few felt inspired, because being small doesn't mean being meaningless. It means being part of something vast, something ongoing, something that doesn't revolve around us. The idea that intelligence could exist without communication challenged everything. No greeting, no warning, no explanation, just presence and absence. That forced humanity to confront a hard truth. We've been asking the wrong question, not is anyone out there, but what if they don't care to be known? That question changes how you look at the sky. The stars don't feel empty anymore. They feel busy, full of motion, full of trajectories that don't intersect with human stories. And that realization quietly humbled a species. People began to understand that observation goes both ways. When we look outward, we reveal ourselves, our emissions, our technology, our curiosity. We announce our presence constantly. Meanwhile, something passed through our system and left no trace of interest, no response, no acknowledgement, which led to an unsettling reversal. What if we aren't the observers? What if we are the environment? Something passed through, sampled conditions, measured energy, and moved on. And we were just there, like trees beside a highway, aware of motion, but not meaning. That thought unsettled governments and philosophers alike because it reframes intelligence, not as a conversation, but as a process. A process that doesn't stop for us, doesn't slow down, doesn't explain. Some people rejected the idea outright because rejection is comforting. Others leaned into it because it made sense. It explained the silence, the restraint, the indifference, the lack of drama. If something intelligent had crossed our solar system and didn't react to us, then we weren't ignored out of hostility. We were ignored out of irrelevance. And irrelevance cuts deeper than fear, because fear implies importance. Irrelevance implies scale, and the scale of the universe had just expanded again. This wasn't a moment of collapse. It was a moment of recalibration, humanity adjusting its posture, standing a little less tall, looking a little more honestly. For the first time, the question shifted from, "Are we alone?" to, "Are we ready to not be central?" That question lingered, because readiness isn't about technology, it's about mindset. And mindsets take time to change. 3I/Atlas didn't give us answers. It gave us perspective. It reminded us that intelligence doesn't always announce itself, that purpose doesn't always include us, that the universe may be full of motion we are only beginning to notice. Public awareness continued to grow, but not into panic, into curiosity, into quiet reflection, into conversations that started with silence and ended with wonder. Because maybe the most important discovery wasn't the object itself. It was what it did to us. It shifted our perception from hunters of meaning to witnesses of it. And that shift matters, because witnesses learn humility. They learn patience. They learn that not everything is meant to be understood immediately. As 3I/Atlas faded from view, something remained behind. Not proof, not certainty, but awareness. Awareness that the universe does not revolve around human curiosity. That intelligence may pass through unnoticed, uncaring, uninterrupted. And that awareness changed how we see ourselves, not as masters of observation, but as part of a much larger system. A system where observation doesn't guarantee significance, where presence doesn't guarantee interaction, where intelligence doesn't always look back. So now the question hangs quietly in the background of human thought. When we look into the dark, are we truly the observers, or have we always been the observed? The sky doesn't answer. It never has. But now, we're finally listening to the silence differently. And that may be the beginning of a deeper awakening. It leaves the same way it arrived, quietly. No announcement, no final signal, no closing statement. Just distance. Day by day, 3I/Atlas grows dimmer, harder to track, easier to lose against the noise of space. The sun no longer illuminates it the way it once did. Angles fade, Reflections soften. The pulse slows, then slips beneath detection. And slowly, almost without ceremony, the data stops. Not because something happened, but because the object is gone, beyond the reach of our instruments, beyond the patience of our senses, beyond the moment where certainty is possible. The screens go quiet, graphs flatten, alerts end, observation windows close, and suddenly there is nothing new to analyze, only what's already been seen. That's when the weight truly settles. Because as long as data was coming in, there was hope. Hope for confirmation. Hope for resolution. Hope that one more pass, one more reading, would explain everything. But now, there are no more chances. 3I/Atlas is leaving the inner system, carrying its patterns with it, its pulses, its silence, taking its origin back into the dark. And that dark feels different now. Not empty, occupied. The scientists do what they always do when an event ends. They archive, they catalogue, they publish carefully worded summaries that say everything and nothing. Unresolved anomalies, further study required. Insufficient data for definitive conclusions. Those phrases appear again. Safe phrases, protective phrases. But they don't close the door. They leave it slightly open. Because no one involved believes this story is finished. It just moved out of reach. And that's harder to accept than a clear answer. Because answers give shape to fear. Uncertainty gives shape to imagination. In private, people replay the timeline. The discovery, the light curve, the heat, the pulse, the reflectivity, the silence. Each piece alone could be ignored. Together they refuse to disappear. They don't form proof. They form a question. And questions have momentum. As 3I/Atlas fades into interstellar space, something else lingers behind. A subtle discomfort. Because this wasn't just about an object. It was about an encounter that didn't behave the way encounters are supposed to. There was no meeting, no exchange, no recognition. Just overlap. Two stories crossing briefly, then continuing on their separate paths. And that feels incomplete. Human history is full of endings that explain beginnings. This wasn't one of them. This was a beginning without explanation. A door opened and then quietly closed. The most unsettling part isn't what we saw, it's what we didn't. No confirmation of origin, no signature of intent, no trace of maker, just behavior, just restraint, just design that never introduced itself. Which raises the question that no dataset can answer. Was this natural? A rare configuration of matter shaped by extreme chance? Or was it something else entirely? Something shaped with purpose, but not for us? That second possibility is harder to sit with, because it reframes everything. If this object was artificial, then intelligence doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with ceremony. It doesn't care if it's understood. It simply exists and moves on. And if that's true, then how many times has this already happened? How many objects have passed through our system just beyond our ability to notice? How many patterns slipped by, unseen, because we weren't looking the right way yet? 3I/Atlas may not have been unique. It may have been typical. And that thought humbles in a way no discovery ever has. Because it means we didn't witness a miracle. We caught a glimpse of routine. something normal in a universe far larger than our expectations. The data is gone now. What remains are interpretations. And interpretations are shaped by who we are. Some will insist it was natural, because that preserves comfort. Some will insist it was artificial, because that preserves meaning. Most will live somewhere in between, because uncertainty is the most honest position. But no one walks away unchanged, because even doubt leaves a mark. The sky looks different now, not because it revealed something, but because it withheld it. Silence has a way of doing that. It forces reflection. It forces humility. It forces us to confront the possibility that not everything we encounter is meant to engage with us, that we may not always be the audience. As 3i/Atlas disappears into the dark between stars, one final thought settles in. What if this wasn't contact? What if it was calibration? A test not of communication, but of perception. Not meant to see if we could respond, but to see if we could notice. And if that's true, then the real result wasn't in the data. It was in us, in how quickly we jumped to meaning, in how carefully we avoided it, in how uncomfortable we became when the universe didn't explain itself. Maybe the object didn't test our technology. Maybe it tested our assumptions about intelligence, about relevance, about our place in the cosmos. And maybe it didn't need to stay any longer, because the moment had already passed. The data ended. The object moved on. But the question remains, hanging in the silence it left behind. Was 3i/Atlas just a natural visitor? A strange but explainable anomaly? Or was it something else? A machine without a message. A design without an introduction. A presence that never acknowledged us, because acknowledgement was never the point. We may never know. And that may be the most honest ending possible, because some encounters aren't meant to resolve. They are meant to linger, to unsettle, to expand the edges of what we think is possible. 3i/Atlas is gone now, but the shift it caused remains. A quiet echo in human understanding. A reminder that the universe does not revolve around explanation. It moves. It passes through. It leaves behind questions and keeps its answers. And somewhere far beyond our reach, something continues along its path. Unbothered, unchanged, silent, carrying its origin with it, leaving us with nothing but the dark and a choice to forget this moment, or to remember that for a brief time something crossed our sky and asked nothing of us at all.